Hello, my name is Dave. I'm a historical interpreter at Henricus Historical Park in Chester, Virginia, and I specialize in Powhatan Indian history in the early 17th century. Unfortunately, our site is closed to the public right now during the current health crisis, and many of our staff are working remotely in order to socially distance. So what we're trying to do now is to reach out to you folks and bring some history directly to you. So today I wanted to show you a basic demonstration on how to fletch a Powhatan Indian type arrow. One of our other interpreters asked me to do some work and some repairs on some of the arrows that he had. The fletchings and the feathers were getting pretty worn out, getting pretty ratty looking. So I had to remove all those materials from the arrow shafts. I'll post a picture of how they looked beforehand if I can. I've already done a lot of the preparation work on those arrows, so I've removed all the material, kind of cleaned everything off. They had a lot of old glue and different things that were stuck to the outside of the wood. So I've tried to clean everything off and sand it down, and they're looking a lot better now. And so this afternoon I'm working on actually refletching those arrows. And I do have an example that I'll show you here. This is one that I've already done, a fairly typical style of Powhatan Indian arrow that you would see in 17th century Virginia. And the way that these arrows were made typically was you would have either a wooden or a river cane shaft. Both materials were used. And it would be tipped. In this case, it is tipped with a piece of stone. It is flint, but other things like quartzite were used. Also, animal bone, deer antler were sometimes used to tip arrows. And things would usually be glued on and tied on with deer sinew. So you see here we have deer sinew holding on the tip of this arrow. And then these are the fletchings that I did. Turkey feather was the most typical type of fletching that would be used. Usually they would actually carve grooves into the shaft of the arrow and then glue the feathers, veins, into that groove in the arrow and then tie it on with sinew. But there are different methods. I usually don't use glue on the arrows that I make. It actually just kind of creates a goopy mess. It makes it really hard to get the feathers on. Typically the feathers want to curl and bend, and trying to hold them in place and glue them and tie them on is pretty tricky. So when I make my arrows, I usually just use the sinew, and they hold on very, very nicely once you tie them on. So as I demonstrate this process, you'll kind of see that just tying them on actually works very well. These arrows are fletched with only two fletchings. We don't have a lot of evidence about Powhatan Indian arrows in the 17th century, but we do have two surviving examples that are known in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, Britain. And those two arrows each have two fletchings on them, not three. So that's the method that I typically use. And in one case, one of the arrows was actually glued on, or I'm sorry, one of the feathers was actually glued on and then tied on, while the other was only glued. So it's hard to say if there were different methods. It may be that different individuals, when they were constructing their arrows, had different means, different methods, different preferences for how the feathers and the fletchings were attached. So in my case, I really prefer not to actually use glue, so we'll just be using sinew today. So this is a finished example. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pause for just a moment, and I'll be back with you folks, and I'll show you the other arrow that I'm going to be working on and how we'll get started. So I'll be back with you in just 1 minute. Okay folks, I'm back with you again, and I have our next arrow here that I'm beginning to work on. This one's a little bit different. This is tipped with quartzite. On both of these arrows that I'm working on right now, the heads are actually on there pretty stably still. I'm not going to take them off or remove them, try to rebind them. They're on there pretty solidly, so there's no need to remove them. If we ever do an arrow demonstration, we might end up losing one of the heads anyway, so we'll take one of those off when they actually start to get loose, and we'll reattach them at that point. This one also has a basic wooden shaft. I don't know the exact type of wood that it is. Mulberry is one possibility, or possibly usually hazel might be used, but I'm not sure for certain what type of wood this was that was used when this arrow was constructed. But I have our feathers here. Again, we're going to do just a standard two-fletched arrow with a pair of turkey feathers that I've already trimmed and prepared. And I've already started to loosely bind the feathers onto the shaft of the arrow. And it's important that when you do this, you want to leave enough space on the rear of the arrow so that you can actually get your fingers around the string and the nock when you're actually using the arrow. So you want to make sure the feathers are moved far enough down from the actual nock of the arrow so that you have space to get your fingers on there. And I'm going to go ahead and start binding this on more tightly. And I usually start at the front. I have artificial sinew that I'm using today. We do sometimes use real sinew in some of our demonstrations, but again, I'm working from home at the moment on this project, so I'm not able to get some real sinew to work with right now. So I'm using some of the artificial sinew. And I've cut a pretty long piece. It's probably about 3 yards long to make sure that I have enough to bind the front of the feathers and then work down to the back end of them and get these fully secured onto the shaft of the arrow. So I'm going to go ahead and start binding this on a little bit more tightly, and I'll be back in a moment with an update for you. All right, folks, we're back, and I have finished binding the front of the fletching of our arrows here. I just kind of keep winding the string around, or the sinew around, until it's really well kind of coated along the entire front part of the fletching. And really, once you kind of get it tightened on a few turns, you can start to readjust the feathers. They're a little loose at first, but they do start to cinch down, and you can kind of move them back and forth and get them positioned how you want. That's another reason I don't really like to use the glue again. You can kind of see the feathers are curling a little bit, and you're trying to get them positioned just so, and as you start trying to bind them on, I've just found that using different types of glue does not work very well for my purposes. But again, there are different methods for making these arrows, and it's very plausible that individual Powhatan people who were trying to make these arrows during the 17th century may have had different methods that worked for them. I find that this method works best for me when I'm constructing arrows. So from here, now that we've got the front bound on, we're going to start actually binding the feathers along the entire length until we work towards the back, and I'll start to show you how that is performed. You're going to start just kind of gently plucking the string, the sinew, down in between the feathers. It'll just kind of break through fairly gently, as you can see. I hope you can see. There we go. And little by little, you just keep winding the cord, twisting the shaft of the arrow, and it will start to break through the feathers and cinch down the vanes. Sometimes it is a little stubborn. You might have to break it apart. This one's especially stubborn. There we go. And it's just one of those things that as you perform the task repetitively, you start to get used to how it goes. Just like any hands-on skill, you get better and better at it just by trying it. So it does move along. And so you can see it usually will create a little bit of a separation between the feathers. It'll make little gaps, but that's natural, that happens, and it doesn't affect the flight of the arrow or anything else. And there we go. So you can kind of see how that's moving along. And little by little, we're just cinching it down. And again, just kind of keep a grip on the sinew itself, on the end of it, and just keep readjusting those feathers as you need to. You can move them around to straighten them out, and little by little the curl will start to go, and the feathers will straighten out along the length of the arrow shaft, and it will start to come together. There we go. All right, so we're about halfway there already, so you can see that this moves along fairly quickly. And I'm going to take another moment here quickly to just pause the winding and actually adjust the feathers, and they're looking really good. You can see that they are pretty well lined up with the nock of the arrow. That's what we're trying to go for. All right, I think that looks pretty good. And I think this will be about our last split on the actual feather. Oh, I lost it. I think we'll do one more quick split. There we go. All right, and again, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of straighten these up. Make sure the bindings are clean. And there you go, fairly even spacing on the thread as we're winding it. And now we're actually to the back, we're past the front, we're past the actual fletching and we're just onto the bare vein of the feather. And now we can start actually wrapping the back part of the fletching. So I'm going to go ahead and pause for a moment and just tighten everything down, and I'll be back with you folks in just a moment. Okay folks, so we do have one little correction that we have to make. If you can kind of see, the upper fletching right now, the back part of the fletching is just a little bit longer than the bottom part of the fletching, and that actually does create a lot of complications when you're winding your sinew around the shaft and the fletching. You need everything to be even, so I'm going to go ahead and just snip off this tiny little back bit of fletching right here, and that's how simple it is to just snip that right off. It really is an easy material to work with. And that is going to allow us to wrap everything together a little bit more cleanly, I think. So I'm going to go ahead and go from there. And there we go. And that's a lot cleaner. There's nothing really kind of bunching up. So that was just a little correction that we had to make. So again, I'm going to go ahead and finish cleaning up and winding the back part of our fletching, and I'll be back with you folks in a moment. Okay folks, so we're back, and I'm just about done here. I've gone ahead and trimmed off some of the excess sinew, and right now I've already tied it off a couple of times, and I'll just do a couple more here really quickly. All you're really going to do is just keep wrapping the sinew and tucking it under to do a simple knot, and as it gets tied down, it'll secure itself pretty well. The nice thing about this sinew, both real sinew and artificial sinew, is it's fairly waxy. It's kind of almost self-adhering. So it tends to bind down on itself really well. So it's a really good material. Again, you could glue it down if you wanted to just kind of secure it. But I have found that a lot of the glues that will be used will tend to cause the sinew to degrade and to not hold up as well. So I prefer to just use the sinew itself and make sure that it'll hold. And so once you have the last little tail of the sinew, you can just kind of wrap it, bind it down, and you'll see it holds pretty well to itself. So there is our finished arrow fletching. Looks pretty good, I think. And all in all, this only took me about 20 minutes, I would say. I think our video length is going to be about 15 minutes, but I just took about an extra 5 minutes to kind of pause and adjust things between shots here. So this is our finished arrow. And I would encourage you folks, if you're interested in arrow making, coming out to Henricus Historical Park when we're open back up again. We are going to be doing arrow making demonstrations, and we may do an arrow making class. If any of you are interested in that, please comment or let us know. We can certainly arrange classes like that where we would provide the materials for a small fee, and you folks could have an opportunity to try your hand at making arrows or doing some other period style skills and crafts as well. I will be back with some more videos hopefully in the next few days. I think I'll do one on moccasin making, so if you're interested in that, please check back. Possibly also on period fire starting or traditional fire starting techniques. So check back in, and hopefully we'll have some more content for you folks later on. Thank you and have a great day, and I hope you all will stay safe and be well. Bye-bye.